By the time the first man reached the cave, he no longer looked like a man from town. He looked like something the storm had chewed up and thrown back. His coat was ripped open. One sleeve hung empty from the elbow seam. Mud covered his face so thick that only the whites of his eyes showed when he raised them toward the steel-framed doorway cut into the stone. Behind him, more shapes fought their way up the slope through rain and flying grit. They had once laughed at the woman who lived here. Tonight they could not even stand straight long enough to knock. Inside the mountain, Evelyn Cross stood with one hand on the locking wheel and the other on the pressure gauge she had bolted beside the frame 2 winters earlier. The cave around her held its deep, steady chill. Her small cedar cabin sat further in, dry and warm under the rock arch, untouched by the screaming air outside. She had built this place so wind could not take another home from her. She had not built it for company. So why were the very people who tried to drive her out now dragging themselves to her door like shipwrecked souls, begging a lighthouse keeper for one more light? 2 hours earlier, before the first desperate figures appeared on her monitor screen, Evelyn had been alone in the control alcove, listening to the mountain absorb the rage of the sky. She could feel the force of the storm in the concrete under her boots, not from shaking but from pressure. Her wind vane had failed first, then the rain sensor, then the outside microphone gave one long burst of static and died. The camera over the lower path still worked, though the image flickered whenever debris struck the mast. On the screen, Pine Hollow had come apart in pieces. The new houses down by the creek lost their shingles first, then porches, then whole walls peeled away and sailed into the dark. A barn roof turned once in the air like a playing card and disappeared. Power flashed, blew over the valley and went black. After that, only the storm moved. It moved like something with a mind, stripping trees, driving floodwater through the road, pounding every weak thing flat. Evelyn did not cry while she watched. She had done enough crying years ago in western Kansas, in the muddy hole that was all the tornado had left of her house. Since then she had learned a harder way to live. Measure first. Brace twice. Build for the real load, not the pretty one. Trust stone, trust depth. Trust what does not beg the sky to spare it. That was why she had bought this ugly piece of mountain no one wanted. The land agent in Washington had nearly laughed when she mailed the payment. The parcel sat above Pine Hollow under a limestone overhang called Widow's Mouth by locals who liked giving cruel names to things they feared. The cave was wide, dry at the back, and set above flood reach. The roof angle broke the worst of the weather. The bedrock floor gave her anchoring points stronger than any slab poured in the valley. Most people saw darkness, damp, snakes, and shame. Evelyn saw mass, shelter, and thermal stability. The first year nearly broke her anyway. She hauled concrete block one stack at a time with a winch rig she built from salvaged pipe and an old truck axle. She drilled anchor holes into the cave floor until her shoulders burned and her palms split open. She laid drainage trench after drainage trench because mountain water never stops testing a structure. She framed the inner cabin with pressure-treated timber, then skinned the outside with cement board and sealed every gap that could trap moisture. Between the cave wall and the cabin shell, she left an air gap for inspection, airflow, and access to the drains. Above the cabin roof, she mounted fire-resistant panels to catch dripping mineral water and guide it away from the living area. None of it was pretty work. All of it mattered. The people in Pine Hollow saw only parts of it. They saw an older woman alone on a ridge, living first in a trailer, then in a canvas work tent set inside a cave mouth while she built deeper in. They saw pallets of block, steel pipe, battery racks, vent ducting, and drums of waterproofing compound. They saw someone who did not join church suppers, did not linger at the diner, did not smile just because a stranger wanted proof she was harmless. Soon the names began: Cave Widow, Rock Rat, Storm Mad. The loudest voice belonged to Curtis Bell, who owned the hardware store and sat on the town board. He had wanted the ridge lot for years because it backed up to land he hoped to sell to a developer from Spokane. Evelyn's project spoiled the view and worse, made him feel foolish. He liked polished things, open kitchens, big windows, fresh siding. He did not like a woman from out of state proving that his fine new homes near the creek were built in the wrong place. Once, at Miller's Diner, Evelyn heard him say it plain enough for everyone to hear. No decent town wants a bunker woman living above it. Folks will think we're one step from the end of the world. Evelyn kept eating her eggs. She did not bother looking up. Another time, when she came to file a permit revision for the vent shaft, the clerk behind the counter lowered her voice and said, "Mr. Bell thinks your structure is unsafe. He says the overhang might fail and take half the ridge with it." Evelyn had set a stamped engineering report on the desk. "The overhang is older than your courthouse and stronger than any roof in town." The clerk glanced toward Bell's office and slid the paper back like it might burn her fingers. That was how it went. Every supply run turned into theater. Men in seed caps watched her load rebar like she was burying bodies. Teen boys hiked up one Saturday to take pictures on their phones. She caught the flash, stepped out from behind a brace wall with a welding shield in hand, and sent them scrambling downslope so fast one left a boot in the mud. By sunset, the picture was on the town Facebook page. The caption called her a cave witch building a prison. Evelyn saw the post that night while eating canned chili on an upturned bucket in the unfinished kitchen. She stared at the screen until the comments blurred. Then she put the phone face down and looked at the small photograph taped beside the workbench. Her husband Daniel stood in it with sawdust on his shirt and one eyebrow raised, the look he used to give when other people talked too much and built too little. "They can laugh," she said to the empty cave. "Wind don't care about laughter." She went back to work. By the second autumn, the cabin inside the cave was finished enough to live in. The main room held heat well because the mountain behind it stayed cool and steady, while the insulated shell kept the living space from bleeding warmth. Her small wood stove needed only a modest fire except in deep winter. She rigged rain capture from a clean drip channel, filtered it, and stored it in tanks she had strapped low against the back wall. Solar panels sat outside on a hinged rack she could lower against the rock face before a storm. A battery bank and a diesel backup system gave her light when lines failed. A narrow secondary vent shaft, bored through a thinner section of rock and capped with steel mesh, kept fresh air moving even if the main entrance jammed. None of that softened the town. If anything, the more complete the place became, the more they hated it. It was proof that she was not failing. Curtis Bell pushed the county to inspect her twice in one season. Then he pushed for a nuisance complaint, claiming the cave-dwelling hurt land values and posed a public safety risk. Evelyn fought every notice with drawings, reports, and code sections. She won on paper. She lost in town. Someone smashed her mailbox. Someone painted GO back on the outer retaining wall. Once on a freezing morning, she found dead rats thrown across the gravel path by the entrance. She buried them with a shovel and said nothing, but she watched the weather. That was the part no one in Pine Hollow understood. Evelyn did not just live in the mountain, she listened to it. She kept records, barometric drops, rain totals, soil moisture, freeze-thaw movement at the cave lip, creek height below town. Wind pattern changes when cold fronts crossed from the west and slammed into warmer valley air. The signs began to trouble her 3 days before the storm hit. Pressure falling too fast. Birdsong thinning out, a strange stillness over the ridge that reminded her of the hour before the Kansas tornado took Daniel. The morning before the disaster, she drove down to town for fuel stabilizer and rock salt. At the hardware counter, Curtis Bell smirked when he saw what she was buying. Stocking up for the apocalypse, Evelyn. She set cash on the counter. "You built 21 homes on low ground and call me foolish. That's rich." His smile thinned. "Those homes sold well. They'll wash well too." The men near the seed display laughed, but not with kindness. Bell leaned over the counter. "You ought to worry about your own hole in the hill. Board is meeting Monday. We may finally shut that eyesore down." Evelyn took her receipt and looked straight at him. "Then pray for clear weather through Sunday." She left him staring after her. That night she checked every latch, every drain, every tank valve. She brought in extra split wood, sealed the outer shutters over the solar rack, and moved tools from the apron into the dry bay. On the shelf by her bed sat the county envelope from the latest complaint, still unopened. She did not need to read another threat to know what it said. By late afternoon the next day, the sky over Pine Hollow had gone the color of a bruise, not gray, not blue, something uglier in between. The air tasted like metal. At 3 o'clock her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "Leave before they drag you out, witch." Evelyn read it once and set the phone aside. An hour later, the first house in the valley lost its roof. Now, with the storm raging full force and her monitor showing human shapes crawling toward the cave, Evelyn turned the wheel halfway and stopped. She knew what opening the door meant. It meant taking in wet, frightened people, some hurt, some panicked, maybe too many to feed for long. It meant letting in the same town that had mocked every load she carried up this mountain. It meant saving Curtis Bell if he was among them. Another fist struck the outer plate, then another. Evelyn drew one breath, slow and deep, and reached for the equalization valve. The moment Evelyn Cross cracked the outer valve, the cave entrance filled with a high, thin hiss. Cold air rushed through the steel seam as the pressure balanced between the storm outside and the quiet interior of the mountain. The wheel of the blast door felt heavy in her hands, not from rust or strain, but from the weight of the choice she was making. Another thud struck the metal plate. "Please," a voice shouted through the wind. Evelyn did not answer. She spun the wheel. The steel bolt slid back into the frame with a series of solid clacks that echoed through the stone passage. She braced her boots against the floor and pulled the door inward. The storm roared into the entry corridor like an animal finally released from a cage. Rain blasted across the concrete floor. Wind screamed through the gap, carrying leaves, twigs, and grit. For a moment, the figures outside were only shadows fighting the gale. Then one stumbled forward into the light. It was Marla Jensen, the town postmaster. Her coat was soaked black with rain and her hair clung to her cheeks like seaweed. She clutched a small boy against her chest, his face buried into her shoulder. Behind her came more. A butcher named Leonard Shaw, a teenage girl with a bleeding eyebrow, two elderly men from the grain co-op. And finally, near the back of the group, half dragging a woman with a twisted ankle, came Curtis Bell, the councilman who had tried to evict her. His expensive coat was gone. His shirt hung open. Mud streaked his face, and one shoe was missing. When he looked up at Evelyn, the arrogance that once lived in his eyes had vanished completely. Only fear remained. "Inside," Evelyn shouted over the wind. She grabbed the door frame and stepped aside. The survivors stumbled through the opening, collapsing onto the concrete entry floor. Water pooled instantly around their boots. The boy in Marla's arms began crying the moment the wind cut off behind them. Curtis Bell was the last one across the threshold. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, staring at the cave interior as if trying to understand what he was seeing. The warm glow from the inner cabin spilled down the corridor, cedar walls, clean concrete floors. Soft light reflecting off limestone, a real home. Then Evelyn seized the back of his collar and dragged him inside. She slammed the blast door shut. The roar of the storm vanished instantly. Silence dropped across the entry chamber like a blanket. Only the ragged breathing of the survivors filled the air. For several seconds, no one moved. They stood dripping in the dim light, stunned by the sudden quiet. Outside, the wind still hammered the mountain, but inside the cave, it was only a distant vibration. Evelyn turned the wheel again, sealing the bolts back into place. "Boots off," she said. Her voice was calm and firm. The command cut through the shock like a knife. The butcher blinked at her. "What?" "Boots off," she repeated. "Mud stays in the entry. Hypothermia starts with wet feet." They obeyed without another word. Coats dropped to the floor. Boots followed. Marla lowered the boy onto a bench and wrapped him in a blanket she pulled from a storage bin against the wall. Curtis Bell leaned against the stone and slid slowly down until he sat on the floor. He stared at the steel beams supporting the cave entrance as if expecting them to collapse at any second. "They're not going anywhere," Evelyn said. He looked up. "I anchored the frame 8 feet into bedrock." Curtis swallowed but said nothing. Evelyn turned toward the inner doorway. "Kitchen table," she said. "Bring the injured." The teenage girl with the bleeding eyebrow stumbled forward first. Leonard Shaw helped the older woman with the twisted ankle. They passed through the interior door and entered the main living chamber. The reaction was the same for every one of them: shock. The cabin inside the cave was warm, bright, and clean. Polished concrete floors reflected soft yellow light from LED strips mounted along the ceiling beams. Cedar paneling lined the walls. The wood stove glowed gently in the corner. It looked nothing like the dark hole they had imagined for years. The teenage girl sank onto a chair while Evelyn opened a steel medical kit mounted beside the pantry. "Name?" Evelyn asked. "Lily," the girl whispered. Evelyn cleaned the cut above her eyebrow and began stitching it without hesitation. Her hands moved steady and precise, the same way they had when she set anchor bolts or measured concrete forms. Curtis watched from the doorway. "Where did you learn that?" he asked quietly. "My husband needed insulin shots twice a day," Evelyn replied without looking up. "Ambulance took 40 minutes to reach our farm." She tied off the suture and taped a gauze pad over the wound. Lily blinked in surprise. "That's it." "You're lucky," Evelyn said. "Another inch lower and you'd have lost an eye." Meanwhile, Marla had found the pantry. The door swung open and she froze. Shelves covered every wall from floor to ceiling. Canned vegetables, rice, beans, water jugs, first aid kits, batteries, medical supplies, cooking oil, boxes of dried meat. Enough food to keep people alive for months. Behind her, Leonard Shaw let out a low whistle. Curtis Bell stared at the supplies with a hollow expression. "We called you crazy," he muttered. Evelyn wiped blood from her hands and tossed the rag into a bin. "You called me worse than that." No one argued. The storm outside raged louder for a moment, shaking dust from the limestone ceiling. The boy, wrapped in the blanket, began crying again. Evelyn moved to the stove and added another log. Heat filled the room quickly. "Eat something," she said. "Warm bodies survive longer." Marla ladled soup from a pot Evelyn had left simmering earlier that day. Bowls passed from hand to hand while the survivors sat awkwardly around the large wooden table. No one spoke for a while. They were too tired, too shaken. Curtis Bell eventually stood and walked slowly across the room. He stopped beside the thick cedar wall separating the cabin from the cave rock. He pressed his hand against it. Solid. Behind the cedar he knew there would be insulation, structural framing, and the limestone wall beyond that. Layers of protection, all the things he had mocked. "My house," he whispered. Evelyn did not answer. Curtis turned toward her. "It just came apart." She looked at him quietly. "Houses built for sunshine don't last in storms." The statement carried no anger, only fact. Curtis lowered his head. No one laughed. After the soup was gone, Evelyn began organizing the room with the same calm efficiency she had used while building the place. Blankets were handed out, sleeping pads unrolled. The injured woman's ankle was wrapped and elevated. "Generator is on a 12-hour fuel cycle," Evelyn explained. "Water tanks hold 200 gallons. We'll ration until we know what the valley looks like." Curtis listened, as if hearing orders from a commander. In truth, that was what she had become, not by title, but by preparation. Outside, the storm raged for another 6 hours. Inside the cave, the survivors slowly drifted into exhausted sleep. Evelyn remained awake. She sat at the control desk watching the monitors. One camera still worked. Through the green haze of infrared night vision, she saw the valley below Pine Hollow disappear beneath water and debris. The town that had mocked her was being erased piece by piece. Evelyn leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes for a moment. She did not feel satisfaction. Only the heavy knowledge that this storm would leave nothing behind except people who now had to learn how to begin again. And for the moment, every one of those lives rested inside the cave she had built alone. The storm did not pass quickly. By midnight, the people inside the cave had stopped asking how long it would last. Question had turned into something heavier. They were no longer wondering when the storm would end. They were wondering what would still exist when it did. Evelyn Cross sat at the control desk near the cave entrance, watching the only surviving camera feed flicker across the monitor. The lens pointed down the ridge toward Pine Hollow. Most of the image was just darkness and flying rain. But every few seconds lightning flashed somewhere beyond the valley, and in those white bursts, the destruction became visible. Trees were gone, entire rows of them. Where the road once wound through the low ground near the creek, a wide brown current now cut through the valley like a new river. Pieces of buildings moved inside it. Roof panels, fence posts. Something that might have been a pickup truck rolling slowly on its side. Evelyn lowered the brightness on the screen. There was nothing more she could do tonight. Behind her, the cave was quiet, except for the steady hum of the battery inverter and the soft breathing of people sleeping across the floor. The warm air from the wood stove drifted slowly through the room, carrying the smell of cedar and damp clothes drying near the racks. 14 people were alive inside the mountain. 14 people who had once crossed the street to avoid speaking to her. Evelyn stood and walked slowly through the room, checking each corner the same way she had checked her construction joints every night during the build. Habit kept her moving. Preparation had always been easier for her than rest. The boy Marla Jensen had carried up the hill was asleep on a sleeping pad beside the stove. His name was Caleb, 6 years old. He had finally stopped shaking once the dry blanket and hot soup reached his stomach. Across the room, the butcher Leonard Shaw snored quietly on the floor beside 2 elderly farmers from the grain cooperative. Near the back wall, Curtis Bell sat upright against a crate, still awake. His eyes followed Evelyn as she passed. For the first time since entering the cave, he looked like he wanted to speak, but did not know how. Evelyn stopped beside the stove and added another log. "You should sleep," she said without turning. Curtis rubbed his face slowly. "I keep hearing it," he said. "The wind." He shook his head. "My house." Evelyn glanced toward him. Curtis stared at the floor. "It just lifted," he continued, "like the whole roof peeled off in one piece. I built that place 5 years ago. Concrete slab, steel brackets, good contractor." "Where?" "Creekside Ridge subdivision." Evelyn nodded once. "I warned the planning board about that soil." Curtis gave a weak laugh. "You did." The words hung in the air. Neither of them spoke again for a moment. Finally, Curtis pushed himself to his feet and walked slowly toward the cave entrance. The heavy steel door stood locked and silent against the storm outside. He placed his hand against the cold metal. "Why did you let us in?" he asked quietly. Evelyn studied the gauge mounted beside the frame. "Because you knocked." Curtis shook his head. "You could have left us out there." "Yes. And after everything the town said about you." Evelyn finally looked at him. "The storm doesn't care who said what." Curtis lowered his gaze again. For the first time in years, the man who once controlled town meetings and property decisions looked small, not powerless, just human. Behind them, a voice spoke from the blankets. "Miss Cross." It was David Harlan, the high school principal. He had been lying near the pantry shelves with his arm under his head. Evelyn turned. "What is it?" David sat up slowly. "You knew this was coming, didn't you?" The question stirred several of the sleepers. Marla Jensen lifted her head from Caleb's blanket. Evelyn considered the words carefully before answering. "I knew the pressure system was unstable." "That sounds like you knew." "I suspected." David looked around the room. "You built all this because of storms like tonight." Evelyn walked to the pantry and poured water from a metal pitcher into a mug. "I built it because wind already took one house from me." The room grew quiet again. David nodded slowly. "I remember hearing something about Kansas." Evelyn did not answer. She sat at the table and drank the water. Across the room, Curtis Bell remained near the door, still staring at the steel frame like it might disappear if he blinked. The hours passed slowly. At some point, the roar of the storm softened. The violent shaking that had rattled the cave mouth earlier faded into something more distant. Rain continued, but the heavy impacts of flying debris grew less frequent. Around 4 in the morning, Evelyn checked the pressure gauge again. The needle had begun to rise. The storm front was moving east. She stepped outside the sleeping area and into the narrow maintenance passage that ran along the back wall of the cabin. The small service corridor allowed her to inspect drainage pipes and structural anchors without disturbing the living space. The rock walls there were damp but steady. The drainage channels were flowing exactly as designed. Water from the ridge above the cave was running down the rock face and away through the trench she had carved along the outer lip 2 summers earlier. If she had not cut that channel, the entire entrance might now be buried in mud. She returned to the main room just as the first pale hint of morning crept through the small reinforced window near the entrance. The sky outside had turned gray, not the violent bruised color from the night before, just the dull gray of a storm that had finished breaking things. One by one, the survivors began waking. They moved stiffly, blinking at the light. Marla helped Caleb sit up while Leonard Shaw stretched his back and groaned. Curtis Bell had not slept at all. Evelyn stood near the door. "It's over," she said. No one cheered. They were afraid to. David Harlan rose first. "You sure?" Evelyn pointed at the gauge. "Pressure's stabilizing." She gripped the wheel on the blast door. "I'm going to open it." The room became completely silent. Curtis stepped beside her. "Need help?" "Yes." Leonard Shaw joined them. The steel wheel turned slowly under their hands. Bolts retracted with heavy metallic clicks that echoed through the cave. Evelyn pulled the door, It moved only an inch before stopping. Mud, debris, tree branches pressed against the outer frame. "Push," Evelyn said. Curtis and Leonard leaned their shoulders against the door. The steel groaned. Mud slid across the concrete as the door forced its way open. Then sunlight burst through the gap. The brightness made everyone in the cave squint. Evelyn stepped outside first. Her boots sank deep into wet brown sludge, covering the patio she had poured years earlier. Curtis followed. He looked down toward Pine Hollow, and the sound that came from him was not a word. It was a broken gasp. The town was gone. Where streets and houses had once stood, only water and scattered wreckage remained. The flood had flattened the valley like a giant hand pressing down on a toy town. The creek had carved a new channel twice its normal width. Rows of homes were gone entirely. Only the foundations remained. Curtis sank slowly to his knees in the mud. "My store," he whispered. Evelyn looked down at the valley without speaking. She had seen destruction like this before, but the people behind her had not. One by one, the others stepped out of the cave. Marla covered Caleb's eyes. Leonard Shaw removed his hat. David Harlan stood frozen. The old town of Pine Hollow had vanished overnight. Evelyn turned back toward them. "We can't go down there yet," she said. "The ground is unstable. Roads are gone." David swallowed. "So what do we do?" Evelyn looked at the cave behind them, then back at the survivors. "We work." Curtis wiped mud from his face. "What kind of work?" Evelyn pointed toward the ridge above the cave. "We build a signal fire big enough for helicopters to see." She looked at the group with steady eyes. "The storm ended. But survival hasn't." The valley below Pine Hollow looked like something scraped clean by a giant hand. Where streets once curved between neat yards and white fences, there was now only brown water and scattered wreckage. Trees leaned at strange angles. Pieces of roofs and fences floated slowly in the flooded low ground. The creek had widened into a muddy scar that cut across the town from one end to the other. No one spoke for a long time. The survivors stood outside the cave entrance in silence, staring down at what remained of their lives. Curtis Bell was still kneeling in the mud. His shoulders rose and fell slowly as if each breath had become difficult work. Evelyn Cross let the quiet sit for a moment. Grief needed space before people could move again, but survival did not wait. She turned and stepped back toward the cave. "Inside," she said. No one argued. The group followed her back through the steel door and into the warm cabin chamber. Wet boots were lined along the rubber mat again. Blankets hung near the stove to dry. The smell of damp clothing and wood smoke filled the room. Evelyn walked to the kitchen table and spread out a rough hand-drawn map of the ridge and valley. "I need everyone listening," she said. The survivors gathered around. Curtis remained near the doorway, but he lifted his head. Evelyn pointed at the drawing. "The bridge over Miller Creek is gone. I can see the debris line from here." David Harlan, the school principal, leaned closer to the map. "Then the road to the highway is cut." "Yes. So we are trapped." Evelyn shook her head. "No." She tapped the ridge above the cave. "We are isolated. That's different." David studied the drawing. "Rescue. If anyone outside the valley survived the storm, they'll start search flights once the weather clears. And if they don't..." Evelyn looked up. "Then we keep living." The statement landed heavily in the room. Marla Jensen pulled Caleb closer to her. "How long can we stay here?" Evelyn walked toward the pantry and opened the door. The survivors already knew what was inside, but the sight of the supplies still surprised them. Shelves packed with food, water containers, medical gear, battery packs, fuel cans. Evelyn ran a finger along the inventory list taped to the door. For one person, about 6 months. She turned toward the group. "For 14 people." Leonard Shaw finished the sentence quietly. 2 weeks. "Closer to 18 days if we ration carefully," Evelyn said. Curtis Bell finally stepped forward. "I'll help track the supplies." Evelyn raised an eyebrow slightly. "You ran the hardware store." Curtis nodded. "I know inventory." Evelyn studied him for a second. The man looked different now. The expensive suits and confident posture were gone. Mud stained his clothes. His voice carried none of the authority he once used at town meetings, but something else had replaced it. Humility. "Fine," she said. Curtis gave a small nod. What else? Evelyn pointed again to the ridge. We need a signal fire. David frowned. Smoke. Yes, big enough to be seen from the air. Leonard Shaw rubbed his beard. The whole ridge is covered in fallen trees now. Evelyn nodded. Exactly. For the first time since the storm ended, a small spark of purpose moved through the room. Work. It was something people could do when grief threatened to paralyze them. Evelyn began assigning tasks. David, take the teenagers and clear debris from the ventilation intake behind the cave. If that pipe clogs, we lose airflow. David nodded immediately. Got it. Marla, you handle food distribution, 3 meals a day, measured portions. Marla tightened her grip on Caleb's shoulder. I can do that. Leonard, I need you splitting wood and building the fire stack on the ridge. The butcher cracked his knuckles. Been chopping meat my whole life, trees shouldn't be harder. Evelyn finally looked at Curtis. And you? Curtis straightened. Inventory and supply management, count everything. Curtis gave a small, serious nod. The moment felt strange. For years he had spoken at council meetings while others listened. Now he was waiting for instructions from the woman he once tried to evict. Evelyn clapped her hands once. Move. The room came alive. People grabbed tools from the storage racks. The teenagers followed David toward the back of the cave, where the ventilation shaft opened behind a protective grate. Leonard Shaw carried an axe outside to begin cutting fallen limbs. Curtis remained by the pantry, writing numbers carefully into a small notebook Evelyn handed him. For the first time since the storm began, Pine Hollow's survivors were doing something other than fearing what came next. Evelyn stepped outside onto the muddy patio again. The sky had begun to clear. Thin sunlight filtered through broken clouds, illuminating the destruction across the valley. The water was slowly draining away through the widened creek channel, but the town itself was still gone. Leonard Shaw had already started working on the ridge above the cave entrance. The heavy axe rose and fell against a fallen pine trunk. Each strike echoed across the hillside. Evelyn climbed the slope toward him. Halfway up, she turned and looked back at the cave. From the outside, it barely looked like a house at all. Just a dark opening in limestone with a small concrete apron and steel door set into the rock. Ugly, uncomfortable, hidden, but still standing. Leonard paused when she reached the ridge. You knew this place would hold, he said. I hoped. He wiped sweat from his forehead. Rest of us built houses to look nice. Evelyn watched the valley quietly. Nice doesn't stop wind. Leonard nodded slowly. They worked for hours. Trees were dragged together. Branches stacked into a massive cone of timber nearly 12 feet tall. When the pile was finished, Leonard stepped back and whistled. That'll burn bright. Evelyn nodded. We'll light it at sunset, smoke during the day, flames at night. Down below, the other survivors moved around the cave like a small camp coming to life. Curtis carried supply crates from the storage room to the main table where he carefully counted everything. David and the teenagers returned from clearing the ventilation intake covered in mud and leaves. Marla distributed simple meals of rice and canned vegetables. By afternoon, the group had settled into a strange rhythm. Work, eat, rest, repeat. Curtis finished writing the final supply numbers when Evelyn returned inside. He slid the notebook across the table. 18 days, if we stretch everything. Evelyn glanced at the page. Good. Curtis hesitated. There's something else. What? He looked toward the cave entrance. I owe you an apology. Evelyn didn't respond immediately. Curtis forced himself to continue. I tried to take this place away from you. He gestured toward the cabin. I said it was ugly, dangerous, bad for the town. Evelyn leaned against the counter. And now? Curtis looked around the warm room. This place saved the town. Silence hung between them for a moment. Then Evelyn shrugged slightly. The mountains saved you. Curtis shook his head. No. He pointed toward the steel door. You did. Evelyn did not answer. Instead, she turned toward the stove and placed another log inside. Outside, the sky slowly darkened as evening approached. Up on the ridge, the great stack of wood waited for flame, and somewhere far beyond the ruined valley, rescue teams would soon begin searching the mountains. The signal fire burned through the night like a second sun above the ridge. Leonard Shaw had packed the stack of timber tight, and when Evelyn lit it at dusk, the flames climbed fast through the dry pine branches. Thick columns of smoke rolled upward into the evening sky. The wind had finally died, leaving the smoke to rise straight above the mountain like a dark pillar. If anyone was flying search routes over the region, they would see it. If anyone was left flying at all. Down below the ridge, the cave glowed with warm yellow light as the survivors gathered inside for the night. The work had exhausted them. Clearing debris, hauling wood, checking supplies, and walking the unstable ground had drained the energy that fear had been feeding them since the storm began. Now that the work was finished, the quiet returned, and with it came the weight of loss. People sat around the wood stove without speaking much. Caleb slept again with his head in Marla Jensen's lap. The teenage girl Lily rested against a blanket pile while David Harlan quietly wrote names in a notebook, trying to list who from Pine Hollow might still be missing. Curtis Bell sat near the pantry with his inventory book. He had counted the supplies twice. Numbers were easier to face than memories. Across the room, Evelyn Cross stood at the small sink, washing the metal soup pot. Her movements were slow and methodical. Water splashed softly against the steel basin. Finally, Leonard Shaw broke the silence. "My brother lived on Oak Street," he said quietly. No one looked up. "He built that house 20 years ago, hand-cut every board himself." He stared at the floor, nothing left now but mud. David closed his notebook. "We'll rebuild." The words sounded weak even to him, but they were the only ones available. Curtis finally stood. "I should say something." Everyone turned toward him. For years, Curtis Bell had been the loudest voice in town meetings, the man who decided zoning rules and building permits, the man who once mocked Evelyn Cross in front of a room full of neighbors. Now he looked like someone who had aged 10 years in a single night. "I was wrong," he said. The words came slowly. "I spent years trying to push Evelyn out of Pine Hollow." He glanced toward her, because I thought she made the town look foolish. Evelyn continued drying the pot. Curtis swallowed. "The truth is, she saw what the rest of us refused to see." Marla Jensen tightened her arms around Caleb. Curtis looked around the room. "We built our houses where the land looked pretty, near the creek, near the roads, easy ground." He shook his head, "But we didn't build where it was safe." The words hung heavily in the warm air. David leaned forward slightly. "What are you saying?" Curtis gestured toward the cave walls. "I'm saying this place is the reason any of us are still breathing." Evelyn finally turned around. Curtis met her eyes. "I tried to destroy the only structure in the valley that could survive this storm." No one interrupted. Curtis lowered his head. "I don't expect forgiveness." Evelyn walked slowly toward the table. She set the clean pot down. "Good," she said. Curtis blinked. "Because forgiveness isn't useful right now." The room went still. Evelyn rested both hands on the table. "What matters is what happens next." Curtis frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Evelyn pointed toward the valley outside. "Pine Hollow is gone." Everyone knew it, but hearing it said out loud made the truth settle deeper. "Whatever gets rebuilt down there," Evelyn continued, "has to be built differently." David nodded slowly. "Stronger foundations." "Higher ground," Leonard added. Marla looked toward the cave entrance. "And storm shelters." Evelyn gave a small nod. "Preparation." Curtis sat back down heavily. "For years, I thought preparation was paranoia." Evelyn looked directly at him. "Preparation is survival." No one argued. Outside, the fire crackled loudly as the signal pile continued burning on the ridge. Every now and then, a branch collapsed into the flames with a sharp pop. The sound echoed down into the valley like a beacon. Hours passed slowly. People drifted into sleep again across the floor. Only the steady hum of the generator and the soft crackle of the wood stove filled the room. Evelyn remained awake at the control desk. She monitored the last functioning weather sensors and checked the sky through the reinforced window near the entrance. Around dawn, the wind shifted. A distant sound reached the ridge. At first, Evelyn thought it was thunder, then the rhythm changed. Thump, 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 rotor blades. She stood instantly. The others woke as the sound grew louder. David rushed to the entrance window. A helicopter. Evelyn moved outside quickly. The signal fire had burned down to glowing embers, but the smoke still drifted upward in a thin grey column. The sound of the aircraft grew stronger. Moments later, a dark shape appeared over the far ridge. A National Guard helicopter. It circled once over the destroyed valley, then banked toward the mountain where the smoke signal rose. The helicopter hovered above the ridge clearing where Leonard had stacked the wood pile the night before. Dust and ash swirled through the air as the aircraft descended. Curtis Bell stepped out beside Evelyn. For a moment, he simply watched the helicopter settle onto the muddy ground. Then he exhaled slowly. They found us. Evelyn nodded. Smoke works. Soldiers jumped from the aircraft and began moving down the ridge path toward the cave. Their boots crunched over broken branches and mud. The lead sergeant stopped halfway down the slope when he saw the cave entrance. Then he saw the survivors standing outside it. Alive, clean, standing upright. The soldier removed his helmet slowly. "We were told the town was completely destroyed," he said. "It is," Evelyn replied, "but the people survived." The sergeant looked past her toward the cave interior. Warm lights glowed softly against the limestone walls. 14 survivors stood safely behind her. The soldier shook his head in disbelief. "You all stayed in there through the storm." Curtis stepped forward. "We didn't stay." He looked at Evelyn. "She saved us." The sergeant studied the steel door, the reinforced frame, the solid mountain around it. Then he nodded slowly. "Looks like she did." Behind them, the sun began rising above the broken valley. For the first time since the storm arrived, the sky over Pine Hollow was completely clear. The evacuation from the mountain took most of the morning. The National Guard helicopter could only carry a few people at a time, so the aircraft made several trips between the ridge and a temporary relief station that had been set up on higher ground 10 miles away. Soldiers moved carefully through the muddy slope, guiding the survivors up the hill while checking for injuries. Evelyn Cross stood beside the cave entrance and watched the process quietly. She did not rush. She had spent 3 years building this place. Walking away from it, even temporarily, felt strange. The first group lifted off just after sunrise. Marla Jensen climbed aboard with Caleb wrapped in a blanket, followed by Lily and the injured older woman whose ankle Evelyn had wrapped the night before. The helicopter rose slowly above the ridge and disappeared over the valley. When the noise faded, the mountain became quiet again. Curtis Bell remained near the cave door with Evelyn. Neither of them spoke for several minutes. Finally, Curtis broke the silence. "I used to sit in town meetings and argue about property values." Evelyn glanced at him. Curtis shook his head. "Funny thing is, none of those properties exist anymore." Evelyn looked down at the valley where Pine Hollow once stood. The floodwater had already begun to recede, revealing broken foundations, twisted fences, and muddy streets where houses once lined the road. The storm had erased the town in a single night. Curtis followed her gaze. "Everything we thought mattered is gone." Evelyn nodded once. "Not everything." Curtis frowned. "What do you mean?" Evelyn pointed toward the cave behind them. "People are still here." Curtis was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded slowly. The helicopter returned an hour later for the next group. David Harlan and Leonard Shaw climbed aboard with 2 of the farmers from the grain co-op. The aircraft lifted again, carrying them away from the destroyed valley. By late morning, only 3 people remained at the cave: Evelyn, Curtis, and Sergeant Miller, the National Guard officer coordinating the evacuation. The soldier walked slowly around the cave entrance, studying the reinforced steel door and the concrete apron Evelyn had poured into the rock. "You built this yourself?" he asked. "Most of it." He ran a hand along the limestone wall. "Smart location." Evelyn shrugged slightly. "The mountain was already here." Sergeant Miller gave a small smile. "Most people build houses that fight nature." He gestured toward the valley. "You built one that hides inside it." Curtis laughed quietly, and we called her crazy. The soldier looked back toward the helicopter landing zone on the ridge. "We've flown over a lot of damage this morning," he said. "I haven't seen another structure still standing in that valley." Evelyn did not answer. The final helicopter trip arrived just before noon. Curtis turned toward the cave entrance one last time. "You coming with us?" Evelyn leaned against the doorframe. "I'll follow later." Curtis looked surprised. "You're staying?" "For now." Sergeant Miller frowned slightly. "Ma'am, the relief station has medical staff and supplies." "I have supplies." The soldier hesitated, then he nodded. "Fair enough." Curtis stepped forward and extended his hand. For a moment, Evelyn simply looked at it. 3 days earlier, that same hand had tried to push her out of town. Now it waited quietly in the morning sunlight. Evelyn finally shook it. Curtis smiled faintly. "When Pine Hollow gets rebuilt." Evelyn raised an eyebrow. "If." Curtis nodded. "When?" He glanced toward the valley. "We are doing it differently this time." Evelyn crossed her arms. "Higher ground." Curtis nodded. "Storm shelters in every building." "Good." Curtis hesitated again. "And maybe a few caves." Evelyn allowed the smallest hint of a smile. Curtis climbed the slope toward the helicopter. A few minutes later, the aircraft lifted into the sky for the final time. The sound of the rotor blades faded slowly as it carried the last survivors away from the mountain. Silence returned. Evelyn stood alone on the ridge. For the first time in 2 days, she allowed herself to breathe deeply. The air smelled clean now, rain-washed. The storm was gone. She walked slowly back inside the cave and closed the steel door behind her. The warm cabin felt larger without the crowd of survivors. Blankets lay folded beside the stove. The inventory notebook Curtis had used still sat on the table. Evelyn picked it up and flipped through the pages. Every supply carefully counted. Every meal planned. Preparation. She set the notebook down and walked to the small window facing the valley. The destruction below was still severe, but sunlight now reached the muddy ground where floodwater had begun to drain away. Already the earth looked different, quieter, patient. Evelyn stepped outside again and sat on the wooden chair near the entrance. The ridge had always been silent like this, wind through the trees, distant water running down the valley. The mountain did not celebrate survival, it simply remained. 6 months later, the valley looked very different. Spring rains had washed most of the mud away, and construction equipment now filled the old town site. New roads were being cut across higher ground above the flood line. Fresh foundations replaced the old ones. The rebuilt Pine Hollow would not look like the old town. Every house now required a reinforced storm cellar. Drainage channels had been widened along the creek, and on the ridge above the valley, the cave at Widow's Mouth had become something of a quiet landmark. Locals had begun calling it Cross Ridge Shelter. Evelyn hated the name, but she tolerated it. One afternoon, a pickup truck climbed the gravel path toward the cave. Curtis Bell stepped out wearing work boots and dusty jeans instead of his old city clothes. He carried a long wooden crate. "Delivery," he said as he set it on the porch. Evelyn raised an eyebrow. "What now?" Curtis opened the crate. Inside were several new solar panels. Town council approved them this morning. "I didn't order those." Curtis shrugged. "Community contribution." Evelyn crossed her arms. "I can pay for my own equipment." Curtis leaned against the truck. "I know." He looked down toward the valley where the new Pine Hollow slowly rose from the ground. "But some debts aren't about money." Evelyn studied him for a moment, then she nodded. Curtis climbed back into the truck. As he drove down the gravel path, Evelyn looked once more across the valley. Hammers echoed faintly in the distance. New homes, stronger foundations, storm shelters. People had learned something. The mountain remained quiet behind her, and the cave that once made the town laugh had become the place that taught them how to survive. Evelyn took a sip of coffee and watched the valley rebuild. She had built her home to survive the storm. She had never expected it would help rebuild a town, but sometimes the strongest foundations were the ones people mocked first, and when the sky finally broke, those were the only ones left standing.